In the war against injustice, it can be all too tempting to demoralize the enemy with cannons of vengeance and bullets of hatred. But this war must be fought with kindness and understanding. Therefore, the criteria in which this debate must be adjudicated on is whether we can prove how call-out culture in its way has manifested is counterproductive and toxic, something we should clearly regret. Two arguments in my speech. The first is why call-out culture is principally unjust, and the second, why call-out culture is counterproductive in a general sense. But before that, what do we support on proposition? We support any and every action to combat words and deeds without the presence of rage and hatred, without the need to strip people of their dignity in a public setting and inflame issues even more. Therefore, we will push for call-in culture. As the name suggests, we will have private discussions and non-targeted messaging that promotes cohesion instead of the misgivings of people. This materializes by pushing more literature on contentious issues like mental health, like racial disparities, to make it clear in the public consciousness that certain things are categorically harmful. Moreover, since this is a regret motion, we would prioritize campaigns, better education, social media platforms, the efficacy of all of this severely diluted by this call-out culture that opposition must defend. Thus, we will also prove how in retrospect, individuals would have been much more receptive to these things without all of this call-out culture existing in the first place. The first argument, why call-out culture is principally unjust. It is important to recognize that no one in this world is born racist, sexist, or discriminatory. For those that grow up and deploy a bunch of offensive language, it is likely they grow up in a world of ignorance, a world of indoctrination, and negative experiences. 3 examples. The first is, for negative experiences, someone who grows up sexist may have had bad experiences with women, associating these issues on a micro sense with the macro sense of women in general. The second example is bullies are more likely to come from broken homes and lack of constructive parental supervision. Thus, they thrive on the fact that they need security and satisfaction that would be sadly missing within their constructs of their homes and their schools. No, thank you. Thirdly, the richer members of society would be ignorant of the fact of acute struggles of people in poverty, the struggles that they would not have to associate with on a day-to-day basis, and thus are more likely to deprioritize these issues. What do these 3 examples illustrate? In all these instances, when someone commits an offense, there is always a story behind it. A story where perpetrators are victims, and when society itself has failed them from the start. The impact of all of this is that call-out culture exclusively ignores the nuances of all the analysis I brought earlier on. Therefore, the offense is viewed with the lens that people that commit these crimes or commit these actions are horrible and not someone that we should engage in the very first case. This makes call-out culture, no thank you, a disproportionate response and over-punishes people that shouldn't be punished in the first place for predisposed biases that they have no reason to be called out for. The conclusion of this argument is the motives of people's actions are independent of the outcomes of said actions and does not justify discriminating against predispositions like the ones highlighted earlier. Before going on the second argument about why call-out culture is counterproductive, sure.
Why are motives important? These people aren't being prosecuted. This is about regulating what we think ethical speech is.
So at the point at which we proved already that we should not punish them principally on this basis, why is call-out culture counterproductive in terms of outcomes, and why the same change in opposition will try to prove won't exist in their world? The premise of this argument of why call-out culture is counterproductive is given there are reasons for people to act in politically incorrect ways. The lack of nuance in call-out culture is ineffective in dealing with the problems that are so pervasive in our society today. Note when someone is called out, what are the realistic responses that we see on side proposition? We see 2 responses. The first is that there are a wide range of responses, but the commonality in much of the responses is that it is human nature to be defensive. It is human nature to have our subconscious protect our own specific interests at the cost of other people's interests. We will prioritize what we view as sacred over someone else. So now that call-out culture is done in public to intentionally aggravate someone else, the defensive instincts within human nature come at an exponential rate, something that opposition has in their world and becomes the default in dealing with, for example, consultations and confrontation in their side of the house. They need to tell us why people would have this defensive instinct that will push them to cross the line even further in certain instances. This means it's highly likely that people will now respond in kind, a downward spiral of malicious and overt displays of aggression. Secondly, although call-out culture is effective in trying to silence people, they don't always change or don't often change the opinions of the very same people that you call malicious, the very same people that are destructive in their world. What is more likely is you're probably going to get accusations levied against them, but what happens is they rally together. Racists can now rally together and say that they are the victims of society, to the point at which day after day they get abused and abused online or threats on the street. All of them rally together as victims, attacked by a politically correct society that is going out of their way to make sure that they don't have a viable chance in society. What is the clear harm of this? The harm of this is that a polarizing effect is created, with concentrated bursts of violent attacks being levied against each other. So on the comparative, we see that racists get far more entrenched in their ways, the point at which there's a lack of engagement, that lack of constructive engagement coming from their side of the house. All they want to push for is telling you that you're racist and you're a terrible person, someone that I should never engage with. What we would rather support is coming out in a private setting with the emotion taken away from it and some engaging with constructive matters that will help both sides. How does this specific issue improve in our world? Communicating with people privately as objective as possible means that it's far easier for the message to sink in. That either wrong may be committed, but it's less damaging to your ego if one person goes up to you and tells you that they felt uncomfortable. What do they have to defend in their world? They have to defend the myriad of Twitter wars that go against specific individuals that are not likely to change because you're visibly attacking everything they principally stand for online. This looks like, on our side, people are more likely to apologize on specific issues, because apologizing is far more reachable, the point at which you don't attack them and prima facie attack ad hominem attacks as well. Their side needs to tell us why people would ever want to change, the point at which they know that they will be attacked, they know they'll be attacked in droves, and they know that they won't be engaged with. That is the realistic comparative that side opposition needs to push upwards. They cannot tell us that people will somehow be silent, the point at which a silent minority can come up and form a group that can actively tackle the specific groups of the specific opposition that exists against them. It is crucial to not fight fire with fire when you're trying to reach a constructive solution. So proud to propose.
What Proposition just spent 8 minutes telling you is that when there is a wildfire, we shouldn't react with a more aggressive manner. We should use a cup of water and hope that the flames are going to be doused. We don't think that that's how life works. We think that minorities live perpetually harmed, perpetually disenfranchised, perpetually stripped of their dignity. And what often happens then is that we put the blame on them. We tell them that you reacting angrily is the inherent problem to why you keep getting disempowered. You shouldn't be angry. You shouldn't have feelings. Instead, bottle your feelings, sit down with your perpetrator, and just hope that you can get through to them. We don't think that that's fair. We don't think that that works. But beyond that, we think that call-out culture is the one way we can make sure that minorities meaningfully get empowerment. Let's talk about what we're going to give you as opposition. The case that we present to you is the following. And essentially the criteria here is, when do we think we regret a means of social justice? What I'm going to bring to you my speech is why we think call-out culture is a legitimate form of justice, but moreover, we think it's more effective in protecting minorities, because they misrepresent the aims of call-out culture here. Call-out culture does not exist to change people's opinions. It exists to get them out of the public sphere where they can keep harming people. It exists to keep them up, right? In the same way that sometimes you can see that you might not change someone who's getting a life sentence, but at the very least they are out of that society and they can't keep harming those people. The two examples are concrete, right? So that's what we're going to give you. We're going to bring you further in the second speech is how we think that call-out culture is specifically impactful in terms of social interaction, stretching beyond the specific minority. But before that, some rebuttal. Let's firstly just do some clear up, right? First, in terms of call-out culture, because what they do here is like conveniently pick the worst version of call-out culture and try and force us to defend that. We don't think that that's what call-out culture looks like. What we have to concede that to a degree that call-out culture has a lot of anger and it has a lot of like people who are essentially just angry about their situations. And we're going to defend one thing that they're justified in having that anger. But we have to recognize that it exists on a spectrum. It's everything from reporting someone on Instagram for an offensive post all the way to that anger. We don't think that people automatically just jump to that anger. Important context is that it's often proportional to the harm that's been done, right? So people say really bad things, like Milo Yiannopoulos saying that Grace Jones is a gorilla, are things that get very bad reactions. But some guy, like who we don't really know, saying I might not like black people is not likely to get as widespread, as violent, as much of a reaction. Call-out culture does not just exist jumping to the end of the spectrum. It works specifically in accordance with the harm being done, right? The second thing that they try and tell you specifically in setup is that they prefer one-on-one interactions. They prefer an amicable kind of way to reach a solution, right? We don't think that this is something that usually works specifically because what often happens in that amicable solution is that people still believe that they are in the right. That's what often happened with rape campaigns, when people were told that you probably shouldn't rape people and that no, they're not asking for it, and essentially amicable pleading to end rape. It doesn't work. It has never worked. Rape is still a massive problem, but specifically in light of all those protests, rape continued to rise, right? We think that these are problems that are endemic to perpetrators, and trying to appeal to them amicably doesn't deal with the fact that those problems are endemic to them. Now let's talk about the matter that they give you. They tell you firstly that it's not justified because you're attacking someone for their predispositions over which they have no control. Note here that they also choose to defend the best of people who just don't know what they're doing. At no point do they talk about people who actually know that they might just hurt all the black people in America with their words, right? But moreover, at no point do they tell us why this predisposition is something that's justified, right? Because we think that we punish people for predispositions a lot. We punish people who are psychopathic for killing, even though it's not really your fault. And that's because we judge the harm of an action on the harm itself instead of just the perpetrator who did it, right? We think that it is just to judge on predispositions because they bear as much harm as someone who could have been doing it on purpose. We don't think that argument stands. But moreover, they try and tell you that it's counterproductive, right? I've already clarified how they misrepresented those aims. I'm going to tell you why it specifically fulfills those aims later in my matter. But they give you two things here. That one, it leads to a downward spiral of aggression wherein you can never get any good outcomes. We don't think this is true, right? We have to accept that in some instances that there may be aggression. But we know what often happens that there's actual room for discourse. It looks like things like Trevor Noah on The Daily Show saying that the Heineken advert where the bottle miraculously passed 3 black people is something that's racist that we shouldn't accept, that leads to discourse and the withdrawal of an advert. Things that can lead to tangible outcomes, those outcomes being the removal of offensive things from the public sphere of life, right? We don't think this downward spiral is something that's inherent to call-out culture. But even if it was, we think that is something that is justified specifically in terms of how minorities choose to interact with people, right? That having operated from a position of disadvantage for so long, we think that it is justified that they are angry. We think that it is justified that they express their anger. People who have been silenced for as long as civilization has been accepted are justified in expressing the kind of anger that they built up. The next thing that they tell you here is that you don't really change anyone, but that they rally themselves together as victims, right? We do think that they do that, but that doesn't mean we start accepting that they're right? It looks like people like the KKK rallying themselves together, but at no point did anyone say, oh, that's call-out culture's fault, let's stop call-out culture, right? We think we often begin to understand them as a group and understand their aims, right? It looks like things like Katie Hopkins putting a target on her head and saying, this is how it feels to be a white conservative woman in the new age, right? And people literally saying, that's the perfect metaphor because the target is fake and you put it there yourself, right? In that we are able to judge these groups even after they rally themselves, we are able to call them out. It doesn't diffuse call-out culture in any way. So what you're getting from my rebuttal is that one, it is something that we think is a just metric of justice, but moreover, we think that is something that, aside from not leading to the harm that they give you, can actually fulfill its aims. Now let's talk about why we think it is just and specifically likely to critique minorities. These points are intertwined. Before that, yeah.
So if the main aim of call-out culture is to ensure people don't say or carry out harmful actions, would you support physical intimidation as an effective method of ensuring this doesn't occur?
No, right? Physical intimidation is something that's done before that. But we think that call-out culture is specifically in terms of trying to address the harms that have been perpetrated onto people, but in a way that is proportional to what they are saying. We're not just going to physically intimidate everyone we think is saying the wrong thing. I think that is something that is proportional to what is being done, and that harm is endemic to words can be dealt with in words. So, why do we think that call-out culture is essential to the liberation of minorities? And this is central to the debate, because call-out culture exists to protect minorities in removing harmful things from the public sphere of life, right? But we think that moreover, they are the most important people in this debate on the basis of historical and current vulnerability, that they're not treated with equal respect to anyone else. This makes them the people we have to evaluate. The side that's going to win this is the side that proves how call-out culture actually affects minorities. Let's talk about how we previously engaged victims. And here, two important things. Like one, was often very amicable to perpetrators. It used to be very nice to them, it begged them to change. But moreover, it put the onus on the victims to then change. It's traditions like ironing women's breasts flat so in hopes that they don't get raped, right? A lot of the onus is put on victims to make sure that crimes aren't perpetuated onto them and that harmful sentiments don't affect them. What call-out culture did was make the problem endemic to the person who is the problem. It's things like men are trash saying that men are actually the problem because men are the people who actually rape women, right? Call-out culture is essential to that. But the rise of it means that people are a lot more comfortable in saying that out loud. It means that the bottlenecking of expression that minorities have had to face for so long is something that becomes less and less normalized because call-out culture is rising. Call-out culture is becoming an inherent part of that society, right? What we think that it does is it makes that expression of justice easier for minorities, that they can react in a way that allows them to express what they're feeling and give them that which they had been denied for so long. But we think that moreover is something that can begin to meaningfully protect them by silencing those who harm them. And on that basis, we think that call-out culture is essential to the sphere of life.
If we look back at the birth of call-out culture, retrospectively, if we took a different approach to solving the problem by flooding the media with information regarding mental health, privilege, and why people should be sensitive towards it, I think it's reasonable to believe that for some individuals that were predisposed to say offensive things, they would have introspected inside Proposition's model. However, it's shameful that there was little to no response on this characterization and this line of thinking from the speaker before me. We expect to hear one later. We've been able to prove from Prime Minister to a reasonable extent there is a likelihood of call-in culture and constructive discussion changing the narratives and perceptions of individuals that were ignorant, had one-off negative experiences, or were indoctrinated and just need a counter-narrative towards the negative experiences that they have faced. And more importantly, even if this wasn't true and the levels of offense would still exist under both circumstances, in Prime Minister we've been able to establish that you don't reduce the levels of discrimination, you rather polarize it and move it to areas where individuals can group up together and offer short bursts of offense, which is likely to be even more harmful. Even if this wasn't true, the general levels of racism increase because people group together. Those that were racist to a minor degree at the beginning get affirmation from those at the top. We are not putting a cup of water on a fire. We'd rather think of it as a stream of continuous water that encourages people to check their privilege and racism at some point. You are the guys that are putting a fire with another fire. Fire is bad, right? Like you're toxic and you're manipulating individuals, and this call-out culture is negative. So I want to make some responses before I move on to positive contribution. My argument is going to be why call-out culture is likely to be toxic, why there's reasons for it moving in that direction, regardless of how side government opposition wants to make it out. Before that, a few levels of response. Firstly, what are the aims of call-out culture? The rationale here, apparently from opposition, is that it's not to change the thoughts of a person, but to remove them from that discussion entirely. That's when we POI'd them regarding physical intimidation. Their response was, it must be proportional. If it must be proportional, then you must also acknowledge from Prime Minister that in a proportional effect, call-out culture doesn't acknowledge the nuances behind a person's thoughts, the nuances behind a person's actions, verbal offense and verbal damage. What does acknowledge that and is proportional, however, is call-in culture, private discussions, constructive discussions. You are the guys that are over-punishing individuals for things that are beyond their control. Proportionality doesn't stand with them. But more importantly, it doesn't even achieve the aim of removing people from that discussion. There was no response towards the polarization that is likely to occur, so the aim of call-out culture does not achieve its goals. Secondly, what does call-out culture look like? Apparently there's a range of things that call-out culture adheres to. I agree, it could go from something like reporting someone on Instagram to calling someone out and being as vicious and angry as possible to their face. The problem is, as much as opposition wants to cop out, they have to accept that to be more effective, an action is more effective the more emotionally charged it is. So when is like reporting someone on Instagram ever created any effects? If you argue that some actions are less damaging, then they also in principle have less effect of achieving the aims you say they do. So at best, side opposition must defend a world where the most effective forms of call-out culture are vicious, angry, born out of hatred, because these are the ones that achieve the aims they say they do. Thirdly, let's look at whether it's alright to judge someone based on predispositions. The analysis of the speaker before me is that it's fine to assume someone's intent because the damage has already been done, regardless of whether they're inherently racist or they just have had negative experiences that have pushed them to do this. This is unfair and unjust as illustrated by Prime Minister, because people have differing ranges of stories that motivate their harmful acts. If it is true that we can acknowledge and are more likely to deal with this in a constructive manner under our world, we don't need to judge people on their predispositions. We can act in according to dealing with those predispositions in a constructive manner on our side. Sure.
So what you're telling us and what your Prime Minister told us is what existed prior to call-out culture. We saw absolutely no changes, which is what created call-out culture in the first place.
No, you don't get it. So if call-out culture, when call-out culture was born, it reduced the effectivity of all of these mechanisms. And I would argue after the point in which call-out culture was manifested, the amount of people that would have otherwise checked their racism and checked their privilege would reduce in your world. So retrospectively, we would be reducing the amount of people that would have created this harm. Last point of response is it fair to put the onus on the victims? The argument, albeit quite late from the speaker before me, is that now we put the attention on the aggressor more than putting the attention on the victims. I think this debate does not extend to criminal offences like rape, sexual assault, because this is about offence that individuals carry out in a verbal conversation. Rape is something that we still prosecute in our world. We're all for information regarding it. People will be able to derive whatever they want from that criminal case. But more importantly, it's more likely that victims are victimized in your world, because when you create this polarized argument between whether sexism is alright, whether racism is alright, oftentimes victims are the only ones that are caught in the crossfire. Because when individuals are forced to be more defensive, forced to be more aggressive, they carry out more, they illustrate languages that are even more discriminatory in nature, that are even more aggressive, because the human nature is just to defend themselves and to protect themselves. And thirdly, and most importantly, as a response to this, there's an expectation of support, especially from victims. So we would argue in a world where we didn't have call-out culture, individuals will be able to amend to some degree the amount of psychological harm that they'd have, or just push it off and brush it off themselves. But in your world, there's an expectation of that support, which isn't oftentimes met, and it's oftentimes met with even more discrimination, even more bigotry, and we don't want to affirm that level of security when we can't guarantee it for those victims. No, thank you. Why do we guarantee? What's my argument? Why call-out culture is likely to be toxic? We've already established that call-out culture is likely to polarize communities and create big differences in terms of ideologies. Why does this become worse? The first harm is that in a verbal fight, it's hard to regulate and it's hard to hold individuals accountable to their actions. There are three reasons why this is likely. When people are attacked, they often respond with counter arguments, and if they can't, they often result into ad hominem attacks. That means attacking the person, not attacking the argument. And we think it's abhorrent that the ways we deal with discrimination, and it's likely to occur inside opposition, is that we deal with racists by offending the appearance of a person, by offending the weight of a person. Because when individuals don't have counter arguments in that discussion that cannot be regulated, they often move into offending the character of an individual. This can work both sides, from an aggressor or a person who's defending that individual. But secondly, it's more likely to occur unintentionally, because people are filled with rage, filled with anger, and at the spur of the moment, they're more likely to give out opinions that are offensive and disheartening. Yeah, sure.
Judges, I think people with enough of an internet connection to push defensive things can't find information to the contrary of what they believe.
people have information outside. I don't get the point of that POI. So in your world, you'd offend people and that's harmful, right? Okay, so third level, there's a herd mentality when it comes to discrimination. So oftentimes when it comes to organized groups, there's a level of herd mentality that's expected of a person. So you're only a feminist if you take a jab at a man. You're only a individual who's liberal if you participate in that level of toxic push of your current ideals. And when someone instigates this level of herd mentality, it's very hard to be sucked out of it in a world where it's expected of you as a person. But secondly, on a second level, we think individuals that are silenced are likely to react to three different harmful outcomes. One, they will move into insidious discrimination. When it's out of the argument in places like employment, they are likely, because they aren't confronted about their racism on a psychological level, they won't give promotions to women, they won't hire women, and it's very hard to call this out because it's very subjective in nature. Two, they will move into microaggressions when it comes to things like just clutching your handbag when you're around a specific group. Thirdly, and most importantly, people move into violence. This is like Elliot Rogers, a member of the incel movement, going on a shooting spree because he thought no one from the politically correct world would understand him. All of these harms are mitigatable under side government. You just need to engage with people on the right nuances.
From the offset, we've emphasized that this debate is about the victims of hate. From the offset, we emphasize that this is about black people, this is about homosexuals, this is about the groups in society that are the most vulnerable and are disproportionately disadvantaged in terms of how societal discourse plays out and in terms of how much power they have to defend themselves. We told you from the offset that the purpose of call culture is to defend these people, and that ought be what the core of this debate is about. Side proposition lives in a world in which they prioritize a 70-year-old white man who requires counseling as opposed to the magnitude of harm that is done to the minorities that he offends. So ladies and gentlemen, what am I going to be proving to you in my speech? I'm going to be proving to you that even if we concede to that framework of this debate being about utility and changing these people, we are still better. But in addition to that, why we are better for social discourse. So why is that? Before I move on to that, let's deal with some issues of rebuttal. The first thing that we need to attack is their model. Their model is a call-in culture approach in which you have one-on-one discussions between the people who committed the act and the person who was affected. From the offset, we have questioned exactly how harmful this is going to be. Because what they would do is put Milo Yiannopoulos in a room with Leslie Jones and have 10 minutes to completely rip her apart. We told you very specifically why there's a disproportionate power imbalance in terms of how these interactions play out, and that's why call-out culture was necessary, because it was societal backing to something that you deserve. Secondly, we tell you that we respond to the idea that call-out culture was unjustified because people are likely to have experiences in life that precondition them to think in a certain way. We gave you several responses. Firstly, we told you that we don't use predispositions as a reason to justify what is obviously harmful actions. Secondly, we told you that in a world of information, you respond, you are likely to have access to opposing views. We think it's unrealistic to say that you don't have any access or interaction with people of the people that you are hurting. And thirdly, let's just do a comparative. Do we comparatively prioritize the ability for that man who has possibly grew up in a racist household to the complete harm to dignity of the people that he offends? What is that harm to dignity and why is it so damaging? Because it inherently attacks you on things you cannot control. It says that because you are black, you are a gorilla, that you are unsuitable for participating in any part of civic society, and that harm is great. It is undermining. It is especially vicious. We said we think that we prioritize those people. But even if it was about those people, we think that we are comparatively better as a side. Why is that the case? Because the proposition argument, the argument the proposition makes here is that call-out culture is ineffective. It's ineffective because people are inherently defensive, and what we advocate is a system in which people perpetually become defensive, and therefore you create a vicious cycle of hatred. Why exactly do we think this is a complete and utter lie? We think that call-out, because in their world, we think that they've strategically made a mistake when they've constructed that argument. If they say that people are going to be defensive when something that challenges their views is brought up to them, we think that their model is likely to do the very exact same thing, because you're prioritizing and presenting people with views that are against what they believe, albeit in a softer way. We think that the exact same outcome is likely to happen. Two, we tell you that you're likely to make them even more pissed off, because it's incredibly demeaning to have these people treat these people as children. Because what you're essentially doing is saying that you have a psychological problem, and that's why you have certain political beliefs, and therefore we will treat you in the best way possible. Anything that's likely to make people more angry and compound the harms that we are trying to stop. Moreover, we think that our side is comparatively better when it comes to shutting out these opinions. Why is that the case? Because in many instances, call-out culture isn't a war between different groups of people. It's society versus a specific individual. Society versus Harvey Weinstein. It's society versus Milo Yiannopoulos. In those instances, we would tell you that that overwhelming force and that the contemporariness in modern culture is especially effective at ensuring that people are unlikely to continue to perpetuate their views. Or at the very least, even if they continue to perpetuate their views, you as the victim know that there's social backing behind your cause, that you are not left in the dark and that those views are not normalized. In those instances, we would tell you it's so much better for victims. Then they told us about racists rallying together and then using that power to exclude microaggressions against minorities. One, we told you that's completely unrealistic. We think that it's unlikely to say that racists are not likely to band together and perpetuate acts of violence against minorities like the KKK. We think that those people are likely to be stuck into their views no matter what you do. That realistically isn't what this debate is about. But secondly, if we're talking about people who are likely to retain the same views, why is this something that is harmful if we can protect minorities? We would say that we would defend social engagement at the point at which it is constructive. We think that their kind of social engagement is not one that would be conducive or desirable in the first place, because you have people who are inherently racist on the extreme side of the spectrum engaging with people who are vulnerable. In those instances, we are winning this debate. Before I move to my substantive matter, yes.
So in call-out culture, isn't it, when call-out culture occurs, isn't it more likely that a group of men are likely to catcall together and likely to throw out even more slurs when they are affirmed by one another?
So on your side, nothing happens to that group of men. On our side, at the very least, there's backlash, there's accountability, there's justice that is so much better. So now let me move on to my substantive matter. Firstly, bringing back Nehu's argumentation, which for a large part was ignored in this debate. What did she tell you? She told you that firstly, minorities are the most important actor in this debate, and previous engagement is comparatively worse and is bettered by call-out culture because you are now linking the harm to the perpetrator instead of the victim, and it's incredibly empowering for victims and therefore it's beneficial. Secondly, we told you that it's principally justified because it's an expression of anger, because we told you these people were historically disadvantaged and comparatively have more access to opportunity and choice and freedom of expression than those people on their side that they want to protect, and therefore it's justified for them to express their anger in this way. Thirdly, we told you that it's effective in giving airtime to minorities and disincentivizing the use of this kind of language in the future, therefore we're winning on all of those grounds minimal response. But let's move on to my substantive matter to deal with exactly how it betters societal discourse, because we need to actually understand what societal discourse looks like currently. It's not the extremes that they paint out of these extreme races. In many cases, we're talking about people who are willing to engage with each other. The problem is the quality of that engagement and how that engagement happens. 70% of Facebook users frequently target people and engage with people who have opposing political views, yet we still have polarization in our society. That reason is not how much discourse that they have on their side of the house, in which they could increase the magnitude of this discourse instead of the quality of it. We think our side is better for quality. That's exactly the reason why Ben Shapiro has minimal backlash, while Milo Yiannopoulos has maximum backlash, because Ben Shapiro conveys his views in a way that is nuanced, intelligible, and understanding, and not offensive. However, that's not the same for other people who blatantly offend minorities. Why do we think that call-out culture is then better for this discourse? Because call-out culture inherently attempts to shift discourse to the center, or at the very least the center-left of the political spectrum. How does it do this? Call-out culture is reactionary. It doesn't act as a form of social engagement. It's reactionary to how that engagement happens. At the point at which you start using racial slurs is when call-out culture comes into effect. At that point, you are disincentivized from using this kind of language when you engage in those discussions. Again, the incentive it then creates is for people to temper themselves when they engage in discussion and make that discussion a lot more productive and a lot more engaging. In those instances, we tell you that civic discussion is better on our side. We are so much more better for discourse. For example, it looks like massive societal backlash after Milo Yiannopoulos called Leslie Jones a gorilla. That's bad because in those instances, the quality of that discourse is harmed, the quality of that discourse is bad. But we don't think that all rightist views are inherently illegitimate. We think that societal discourse is important. It's how that social discourse happens that needs to decide who exactly wins this debate. And that's important because our side is so much better, because on their side, they would have no defense and no accountability measures for people who decide to cross the line, because the people who decide to cross the line can easily do so again and again and again because they are ineffective at solving the harms that those people pose. On our side, at the very least, there's an incentive to temper yourself as a moderate. At the very least, societal discourse is improved. I'm proud to propose.
As a brown person in Malaysia, I know that it is all too easy to get carried away fighting the war for equality. But what we often do not realize is that the people caught in the crossfire are the most vulnerable and the people that we were trying to protect to begin with. Two questions I'll answer in this speech, and hence two metrics this debate should be adjudicated upon. The first, in principle, is it legitimate to call individuals out? Secondly, where do we provide better outcomes for victims with regards to lessening the influence of perpetrators, and secondly, with regards to victims. I'm going to deal with the most contentious part of this debate first, with regards to where we help minorities more. Because note that if we prove that we protect minorities more, then we also to some degree win the principal battle, because a lot of the principal argumentations from opposition are contingent upon protecting minorities more. So I'll deal with this in two methods. The first premise op has is that they have accountability towards perpetrators. We say a number of things. The first, perpetrators are likely to be angry because of their self-preservation instinct, and they are likely to act defensively. So maybe it's true if we talk to people one-on-one, they will still be angry, but people are less likely to be angry in our world if we approach them intellectually. On a net, individuals are more likely to respond constructively when individuals have the courtesy to pull them aside and talk to them nicely, as opposed to shame them in public, as opposed to release intimate details of them in public or taking away their Instagram accounts. But secondly, even if it's true perpetrators stop for a certain period of time, we think when they eventually do act out, it's likely to be in short, concentrated bursts that are more harmful on the net. So they are more likely to do things like be violent. They are more likely to do things like be microaggressive, as opposed to a world where they make a bad statement. We would far rather them making harmful statements as opposed to not hiring minorities, as opposed to hurting minorities physically. But thirdly, I think opposition asserts to you that individuals are likely to hide. But I don't get this premise. Why would they start hiding if they are in the majority? The more likely thing for them to do is find people to gain affirmation from each other to fight that minority. And they're likely to be able to gain this affirmation, ladies and gentlemen, by the simple fact that they're in the majority. You make the power dynamic worse because the majority has an incentive to band together and attack the minority collectively, right? Yeah. So have you seen? This means you lose the public war, because for every minority you gain when you call people out, there are 1,000 majority people that come out in support of that individual. The comparative is, have you seen, a one-on-one interaction in our world where the power dynamic is not as apparent, where an individual can talk to you as one human being to another, as opposed to a far smaller community trying to challenge a larger community. When you make the interaction about race, it's far harder for us to interact, as opposed to when it's a friendly, constructive discussion where I'm trying to make you better. Have a seat. Even if it's true, even if their premise is true, that individuals are likely to hide their feelings, we think this is horrible. In a world where they hide their feelings, they mean you can never constructively engage with them, because you don't know who is racist, you don't know who is sexist. Have you seen? People still hold bigoted views, people still have microaggressions, people still don't hire individuals. They are more likely to vote for Donald Trump in the world of opposition because they can still because their votes are still private, they can still do whatever they want in the ballot box. The comparative is when individuals feel comfortable about talking about their views, we are more likely to be able to correct them privately, we are more likely to discuss it amicably, right? So the conclusion is, at the very least, even if individuals hide it in your world, we cannot engage with them, we cannot change their minds. Have you seen? But the second level to this issue, where are the perpetrators more likely to believe they are right? Two responses. A, within an opposition, when you react with emotion, these majority individuals are also likely to react with emotion. The problem with emotion is that it is often irrational. As a result, A, you cannot pinpoint the problem, as in we don't know why this individual is being racist, and as a result we cannot constructively correct that individual. But secondly, there will never be a compromise. In a world where individuals are irrational and emotional, they have no incentive to compromise because it feels like a concession. I'm not going to concede in public that I'm wrong in their world, and I have no incentive to make a compromise. The comparative is a smaller hit to my ego. If I tell a friend, yes, I think I might have been wrong, I'm more likely to concede, I'm more likely to compromise. What is the comparative and why do we win this? Have a seat. This is important, guys. I think you should listen. We think that perhaps you won't make a 360 degrees change, but you're more likely to talk, you're more likely not to be turned off by intellectual discussion. Even if you don't change completely, you're more likely to be less hostile in the world of proposition. You're more likely to be slightly more moderate in our world, and that's a benefit we guarantee to you. But before I move on, defend yourself.
How is what you're saying not call out culture?
it's not, right? We told you the premise of call-out culture is two things. One, that you react with emotion. Two, it's in public. The comparative in our world is when we talk to an individual in private, when we don't say you're a horrible person for doing these things, but rather, I felt hurt by it and we think you should constructively engage with it. But even if we don't have that, we told you that we have like media narratives and so on, and people are more likely to listen to those media narratives about checking their privilege, about not being racist, the point in which they don't feel attacked. Second premise in this issue with regards to victims. So opposition makes this very bold assertion that we put the onus more on victims in our. This is untrue for a number of reasons. Firstly, there's more victim blaming in the world of opposition because people feel a need to shift blame. In a world where you create blame, in a world where you create guilt, in an effort to alleviate their guilt, they're not going to concede, they're going to shift that blame, shift that guilt. Because it's far easier for the majority to shift guilt than to simply concede that what they did is wrong. Especially in the public sphere where they don't want to lose credibility. But secondly, only popular people with social capital, have a seat, can call other individuals out. You make calling out a prerequisite to gaining closure. The comparative is a minority can feel safe, can feel happy even without calling out. The reason why this is important is because it proves that calling out is often inaccessible for a large amount of people that don't have social capital to call individuals out. Have a seat. But thirdly, and most perniciously, you allow racists to play the victim card in the world of opposition. That means all the moral high ground, all the moderates and people on the fence that just, or like, they may not be racist, they may not support Black Lives Matter, but they just think it's not nice to do horrible things to people. You lose these individuals, the point in which you allow racists to say, I'm being attacked, I'm the victim, and it no longer, it's more morally ambiguous in the world of opposition, and as a result, there's more political capital for racists, more capacity for people to discriminate. You're more likely to create racists in their world because people don't care. But lastly, you shift discussion to echo chambers to get affirmation because it's harder to be in the public sphere. Last response, there's more self-accountability in our. People are more likely to introspect in our when they don't feel attacked. But very briefly with regards to this principle, the only principle they have is that minorities are justified in being angry. We don't think this is true. Because firstly, your anger actively makes it harder for other people to gain acceptance. Every time you get angry, you create 1,000 more racists. You create individuals that will attack your minority community. Your individual right to be angry should never supersede a community's capacity to gain acceptance, especially when they don't necessarily consent to your capacity to be angry. But they don't respond to our principal argumentation about how individuals are predisposed to being racist sometimes. So the premise is often we don't know someone's upbringing. As a result, we cannot punish an innocent person. That's why punishing one innocent person is worse than letting a guilty man go free. As a rule of thumb, we should try and understand the nuances of people as far as possible. Even if we let someone horrible get free, at least we protect the capacity for people to be safe, at least we protect minorities. Never been proud of before. Thank you.
Madam Chair, what the world looked like prior to call-out culture was a world in which we prioritized teaching individuals about exactly what happens within our society, having educational programs where we tell people, don't be a rapist, don't treat women unfairly, don't do all of these negative things. What the result of that was that rape statistics in the USA rose by a considerable amount and all over the world. What's important to notice is that literally everything they've been telling you within today's debate is what the world looked like prior to call-out culture, and it was largely ineffective in achieving any of their aims within today's debate, which is why call-out culture exists in the first place. You can't propose an alternative that already existed and was ineffective in solving those problems. What is this debate about? Firstly, we think throughout their entire bench, most of within the third, we get an extreme characterization of what happens within call-out culture in the first place and how people interact with it. No, we don't think we're going to have a bunch of mobs with torches running out in the street harming minorities. That's not what the world looks like. In fact, we're more likely to get individuals to apologize for the wrong things that they do, even if we don't prioritize that within today's debate. People like Kevin Spacey, Harvey Weinstein, and Russell Simmons actively apologized for all of the harms that they created, for all of the injustices that they did towards women. They don't show you why that isn't something that's realistic. Secondly, they tell us that this debate isn't about rape because they still prosecute that. Recognize what's important there. It's an implicit concession that no matter what your reason may be for why you commit that action, it is more than fine to prosecute you because the action is harmful in and of itself. That's why we prosecute rape, and that's why they're fine with it in the first place, right? You don't change those things under your side, you still get that problem existing. Lastly, in terms of clarity, recognize we didn't need to show you that we change people's opinions. This debate is beyond the spectrum of wanting to appeal to those very same individuals that oppress you. What all of this looks like is saying, I no longer care about your opinion because it's something that can exist now and not exist later, but I want to be liberated as an individual and exist in a society whereby I feel comfortable and there's a space in which I can express myself. You don't get any of that under their side. Two issues in today's debate. Firstly, is call-out culture principally legitimate? Secondly, does it produce positive outcomes? The first thing that they tell us under this issue is the idea that it creates a standard whereby you can only be liberal if you get involved with call-out culture. No, right? That's not what it seeks to do. What call-out culture does, in the vast majority of instances, is that it says it is more than fine even if you don't engage with this. You must recognize that these are the views that are correct. This is what needs to happen within this instance. Secondly, they give us this idea that only people with social capital are able to access call-out culture. No, that's a lie, right? The reason why call-out culture is largely effective is because not only people with social capital can do it, but normal people existing within our societies. The victims of people like Russell Simmons aren't famous individuals who are able to gain a lot of social traction, but they were able to call him out because it's not only accessible to those individuals. You don't do any of that under their side. And the third thing that they give us under this issue is the idea that people are more likely to apologize in a space that is nice and safe and away from everyone else. Firstly, recognize that call-out culture is a reactionary mechanism to people already publicly making awful statements, right? If you make a statement on Twitter that's racist, why am I not allowed to have a reaction on that very same public platform that you chose to express that statement on? You don't get any of that under their side. But secondly, if it is a majority and all of their analysis is true about how the majority supports your opinion, you are more likely to not listen to those individuals in a private sphere anyways, because you have absolutely no incentive to take their views into account because your society affirms you under their side. We recognize here that they don't change anything under their side. Call-out culture is what's more legitimate. The last thing that they give you under this issue is the idea that it doesn't take into cognizance the different ideas or the different reasons why people commit a specific action. Recognize that our burden in today's debate is not to fix people and to change their opinions. That's not what we're here to do. The action you are doing is inherently harmful, and that's what we want to attack. But even if this debate was about changing those very same individuals' opinions, at the point at which we threaten something of yours that you find important and we react to those very same comments, we are more likely to get a reaction from you that's going to be somewhat beneficial. The conclusion here then becomes that the idea of call-out culture is legitimate because it enfranchises those individuals who are disenfranchised. I'll take you.
When one person is racist to another person in your world, another 100 people can join him in his fight. How is that proportional, and how does it help change him to be less racist?
No, right? That only exists in your world. Because firstly, I told you that our purpose is not to change racist people's opinions, but secondly, we don't get a large amount of individuals joining into that very same idea anyways. When politicians make largely problematic statements, you don't get a lot of people being like, hey, these statements are correct. No, you get a backlash from that very same society, and those people are less likely to make those comments in the first place. That's why those politicians apologize. Second issue, does it produce positive outcomes? First thing that we get under this issue was the idea that people are going to become, is the idea that we shut out people's views and polarize society to a great extent. Recognize here that at the point at which Firstly, we think that call-out culture, as I've told you, is a reactionary mechanism. So it reacts to those views already existing. Call-out culture exists because those views are already something that's prevalent within that society. We don't think that it's something that exists there. But secondly, if those views are harmful to individuals, we are more than fine with shutting them out in the first place, right? The way in which rights operate is that if your right is actively infringing upon another individual's right, we are more than fine with limiting that right, which is why sometimes we limit free speech when it actively harms other individuals, right? You don't show us why this is a problem under your side. Second thing that we get under this issue was the idea that people people are more likely to not listen to this because they're being actively harmed by these opinions. The way in which society has worked to a great extent, and the reason why we can actually give you evidence as to why call-out culture has been something that's effective beyond just a dialogue that exists on a specific social media platform, it looks like people, I'll take you in a second, it looks like firstly, Bill Cosby going to jail because of the amount of rape that he's committed. The Me Too movement, a part of call-out culture, was very pivotal to that system. Tell me why I'm wrong.
So, reactionary forces can exist on both sides. The point at which minorities rile up against the KKK or other forces, they can also rile up against minorities. How does this be constructed?
No, right? That's not how it works. But secondly, even if they had the ability to rile up against them, that means that they understand. That means that firstly they're angry, and that anger is a reaction to the fact that they recognize that they're under threat and they can't harm these minorities because there's an accountability mechanism that already exists. This is what we have under their side. But secondly, what has been an offshoot of that very same call-out culture? It looks like being able to achieve everything that they want. It looks like call-out culture being actively discussed on public platforms where people have interactions about the very same things that they want to have interactions about. The two policies are not mutually exclusive. We told you that ours is much more effective because we're able to get tangible outcomes. It looks like Harvey Weinstein being fired from his job. It looks like Kevin Spacey being fired from the television show. Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to side with opposition because we showed you why we actually protect those very same minorities.
Ladies and gentlemen, call-out culture is something that is a lot more fluid and a lot more adaptable than proposition would have you believe. And this is what we told you from the moment we started our case. That we think that call-out culture exists on a spectrum, and perpetually they continue to engage the most extreme and the worst side of call-out culture and say that they then regret that. We engage them even on that ground, but we told them specifically that we think that given that it exists in so many forms, we can't regret it on the basis of what it can do and what it has done. How are we going to judge this debate? On 3 levels, right? And this is the criteria we gave you in the op one. It was never challenged. We think this is how we're going to judge the debate. One, is call-out culture principally justified? Secondly, does it protect the most vulnerable? And thirdly, how then does it affect discourse? The prioritization of those ought to be specifically on the victim first. Who is likely to be better for them? The second, we think that the discourse is basically the least important in this debate. Before that, let's know something important in terms of their strategy. They give us a lot of harm. They try to frame as spin-off effects of call-out culture, but we already told you that they pre-existed call-out culture and are not inherent to that, right? But moreover, they frame that it gets worse because people are defensive, doing no work to prove why people who are naturally defensive when being challenged are unlikely to be defensive when some random person slides up in their DMs and says, I don't like what you said, right? They never actually make those links. We told you that we think that's something that's highly unlikely. Okay, let's start with the first clash. Firstly, in terms of principle, what did they tell you? They told you that you judge someone who does not know what they're doing and that they're predisposed to this. We already told you that we think that one being ignorant is largely going to be a choice of yours in this situation, right? It was important when we raised that POI, that people have access to information. If you don't know it, that's your choice. But even if you are predisposed, we told you that we judge on the basis of predisposition when it is illegitimate and when it harms people. Contrast that to what we gave. We told you that it is proportional, right? Told you that words are fought with words. What's on the internet is fought with what's on the internet. That's why their physical intimidation thing can't really fall through. But we specifically told you that it harms a community. This is important, right? Because that harm to a community is what also feeds that proportionality. That you're not just harming one person, and on that basis you're going to be held accountable. You are harming black people, and black people hold you accountable. They never engage with that proportionality, right? What they tell you instead is that your right to express yourself should not supersede community interests. But at what point are these interests different? We never really understand that either, right? We told you that it is for the community in terms of making sure that minorities as a group can get closer to liberation. But assume that they're right. Let's do the comparative. were willing to sacrifice innocent people for the sake of prioritizing those who had never been given a voice before. If you care at all about this principle, we think that proportionality ought to outweigh sacrificing the few innocent lives on their own side. Secondly, let's talk about who is the most vulnerable, right? And here, we clarified that this was the most important thing. Give you two things. That one, minorities get to speak from a position of power that had previously been denied, but secondly, that they link the harm directly to the perpetrator as opposed to themselves. What do they tell you? They tell you that you're likely to get more victim blaming, right? We already told you that victim blaming is inherent to the way the system works in making sure that the onus to prevent any kinds of social crimes is on victims, right? They had to de-establish that link before that. Told you that it's worse because it is normalized. We don't think that's stats. But moreover, what they tell you then is that some people can't access that. And I don't know, but we don't think that aside from the fact that that's not basically a real thing, we think that even in the instance in which some people can't access, we think that it's still important that a lot of people can access it. We told you that it is accessible to people who are on the ground, average people, not just celebrities, right? What you're getting from this is, on that comparative, we think that we are likely to protect victims more because they reserve the ability to call other people out. They sensitize the society and they speak from that position of power. That is more important than what they gave. The third thing was on discourse, right? And here they were very extreme. They tell you that one, we're likely to just get into a downward spiral of shooting jabs at each other. We already disproved that. But moreover, they tell you that racists are likely to flock, gather, and get worse, right? We told you that we think they were still able to judge those groups on the basis of how they gather, right? But note that by their own analysis, if you keep polarizing people, we can get a better discussion in the middle. And on that basis, we think that call-out culture is essential not only to minorities, but to making discourse better in terms of the progression of society.
Start off as a piece of work because they try to win this debate by jumping between convenient examples and convenient characterizations in an attempt to deal with our arguments. And if that didn't work, they just went on this whole tangent of matter dumping at third, leaving us little to no room to respond. I'm going to illustrate where this has happened. So what am I going to do in my reply speech? I'm going to first look at the principle, where does it occur? Secondly, what does call-out culture look like? And lastly, what's the comparative? Clearly illustrating why we're the more reasonable side of this debate. Let's look at the principle. We told you every perpetrator has a story behind it. Every individual has a reason. Calling out doesn't address specific nuances. And in a world where we might have some proponent of changing individuals, we would rather invest within it. Their counter principle was minorities, which is something we also think we took down. If we were able to illustrate that minorities are still likely to be victimized in a world where call-out culture existed, then call-out culture in name doesn't work in protecting its individual. But if that didn't work, they just moved on to this idea that it's a regret motion. So the regret logic is at some point we created call-out culture, therefore we can't push alternatives. So it works, right? Regret, our motion, our side wasn't perfect. Maybe to some degree there were increases in crime rates, maybe to some degree there were increases in hate speech. But the point which means you started call-out culture, stats of rape didn't reduce, stats of crime didn't reduce, stats of hate speech didn't reduce, which also illustrates that under both circumstances there's a reasonable level of harm. Just retrospectively, before call-out culture, we would argue that it was lesser, and that's how we win that discussion. Let's look at what call-out culture looks like. So I'm going to break down how they jump, right? So there's an instance where the perpetrator is in the majority, and an instance where the perpetrator is in the minority. If the perpetrator is in a majority, then calling out doesn't really do anything. What is an African American going to do when he calls out a white person? He's more likely to be discriminated in the world of opposition. I don't understand where there's this social capital to fight for him as an individual. Similarly, with catcalling and sexism, men are more likely to surround themselves with each other and catcall in groups. And if this is true, and women do have less social capital in society, I don't understand why call-out culture is likely to manifest in positive outcomes. And thirdly, when it comes to politicians and public figures, they might be in the majority, which is especially why when people like Bill Cosby get acquitted, there's heavy victim blaming. Individuals always throw out racial slurs, further victimizing those victims. We would rather a world where none of this happened. We might not provide comfort to the person, but we won't victimize them because the aggressor is from a majority, and thus there's more victimizing occurring. So in this instance where it's a majority, they try to jump. They try to say, you know, we'll always have the social capital for that one African American kid. We'll always have the social capital for that woman, but it won't work out in instances where they are a prosecuted minority in society. But let's look at the second instance. What if this perpetrator comes from a minority? Let's say someone who's insensitive to mental health issues. I would argue a group in society that is particularly smaller. What then happens in our world? We told you because they are so attacked, they band together and affirm each other and then go on a tangent of trying to offend other groups in society. And this is more likely in a world where they believe they are the alienated individual. They believe they are the victims in this larger picture. So if they are a minority, I don't understand why they're likely to apologize, rather relate to others that they believe that they are a victim of political correctness. Then they try to say there's a spectrum of calling out. If there is a spectrum, the spectrum that is least emotionally charged, also the least effective one. We don't expect you to go at people with torches. What do we expect? We expect things like ad hominem arguments. My argument as a second speaker. We expect things like insidious discrimination. We expect things like a herd mentality that says you aren't a feminist if you take a jab at that man in this discussion. In this spectrum, it is more likely that it becomes toxic as a result of calling out, and in that discussion we argue that it's worse. What is the comparative? The comparative is really simple. If this individual is from a majority, we understand to some degree we can't fight his influence, but a one-on-one power dynamic is likely to be stronger than a 1 to 100 power dynamic. If you have an honest conversation with someone who isn't very malicious, he's likely to win it out. But if this person comes from a minority, per se the person who is insensitive about health issues, we are more able to check his privilege, we are more able to check his bias, his intuition when it comes to being insensitive about specific issues. They try to jump between characterizations to prove why this is unlikely. Regardless of who this individual is, I think it's reasonable to believe they will check their understanding, check their ideas. We will win this debate.